Whenever, let me do the got it thing. Okay. Whenever people introduce me saying that I've been around for a long time, I have to think it shows in my beard. It starts getting really, really gray. But there we go. Okay, so let me start by sharing the screen. Okay, I'm sure you can see all this. I hope so. Okay. So, okay, so thanks very much, everyone, for joining this, and thanks, Tobias, for the invitation. So, Tobias had asked me to talk about, he basically said, do something introductory on basic income, talk about social protection, and also do something normative, which are like three big packages. I'm going to try and squeeze that all in something that sort of makes sense. Effectively, it's going to be sort of two parts. There's going to be a first part where I say more general things about basic income. And of course, I'm aware that there's people in the room here who know basic income inside out. So this may be a little bit trodden territory, but still I'm going to put my own twist on it. So hopefully there's still a few things there that are new. And then on the normative side, I was thinking what would work best, because of course you have a lot of normative angles. I'm aware of course we had an Ubuntu lecture first, and then Bernard Neumarker was talking about the social contract theory. I'm not a social contract person at all, so my normative background would be in a very, very different way. But I thought that the thing that would make most sense probably would be to link it with some work I've done about basic income as a social right, which was very much driven by this sense that people often talk about we should have a right to basic income, but what does that really mean and how do we get there? And, basically looking into this from a sort of philosophical/legal perspective, thinking about it as, are we talking about a moral right? Are we talking about the legal right? What about constitutional right? And so on and so forth. I'm hoping that the second part does actually sort of link into the first part a bit, but we'll have to see how it goes. Okay, so without further ado, so part one, conceptual and functional stuff. What is basic income? So let's start with definition, right? It's always good. So you've seen the picture here. Everyone is familiar with the Pope of basic income, Philippe van Parijs, and his lead bishop, Archbishop Yannick van der Burgt. So this is taken from, their latest book, which is now like whatever, 5-6 years old, but still very much the reference work, right? So they basically argue that the definition of basic income, one of these simple but crucial, is that of an unconditional basic income, a regular cash income paid to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. So that definition has a number of different components. It's regular, it's cash, it's paid to all, it's individual, and it's unconditional, neither means test nor work requirement, and so on and so forth. So people here, many of you are familiar with the sort of standard definition. It's worth mentioning that that definition is still kind of under challenge, if you like, right? There's actually, people are still, for example, debating whether the level of basic income should be part of the definition and so on and so forth. There's a lot of interesting work being done on this, but I'm just going to reference this one. I just want to tag one other little thing here from this sentence, which is when they write one of these simple but crucial, as in basic income being a simple idea. To my mind, that's the biggest con trick in the basic income discussion, right? Basic income looks very simple, but actually it isn't. So one of the things that I've been doing for many, many years, and I'm also going to be doing here, is try to introduce a lot of complexity into this. And I think it rapidly becomes clear that basic income isn't as simple as is often put forward, okay? So starting from this definition, I want to make a couple of sort of comments/qualifications in terms of, sort of issues that matter when we think about this from, say, a public policy/social protection perspective. So number one, I was very happy that Clem is joining us, because Clem's from Australia, and here we have her no doubt favorite animal, the platypus. So I see basic income from a social protection perspective. I very much see basic income as the platypus of social protection. Now, the platypus in the picture here is a very, very strange animal, which seems basically like made up from parts from different animals, right? The beak of a duck and the tail of a beaver and some other bits here and there. So you take 5, 6 animals, you take different bits, you whack it all together and you get this new thing. Basic income is very, very much like that. If you think of it from a social protection perspective, all of the components of this basic income definition we're very familiar with. You know, we know what cash is, we know what individual systems are, we know what universalism is, we know what unconditionality is, we know what regular is, and so on and so forth. What makes basic income unique is the way in which it's put together. So the moment you put it together in that particular configuration, that's when you get a policy that is really new and also quite controversial and evoking strong reactions for that reason, right? So the reason why I'm saying this is when you engage with people from a social protection perspective, you often have this sort of tension between, is this something we know or is this really a new thing, right? So this always comes up because the elements are familiar, but the combination, so to speak, really gets us into new territory. And new territory also means that in many, many cases, we kind of have to assume how this will work in a given context and so on and so forth, right? You know, so we don't necessarily know everything there is to know about basic income, despite a lot of ongoing pilots and experiments and so on. So we're very much in the business of finding out, right? And the reason why it's important to find all this out is, sorry, I actually forgot to put my thing on. Okay, never mind. The reason it's important to find out all these things is precisely because that combination thing really does get us in different territories. Okay, so if you have all these components of the standard definition, you can play around with variation in basic income design. So there's actually two big problems, but two very, very different types of problems. The first one is that the basic income definition basically leaves a big gap. That's the donut problem. So there are key elements of basic income design that are not necessarily part of the definition. One of the biggest is the level. Like, are we talking about a sort of a level of basic income that allows a single individual to basically, you know, survive at the poverty line? Is it less? Is it more? And so on and so forth, right? But it's not the only thing. For example, another thing is, how is this going to be funded? Another thing is how does this interact with a variety of other social protection mechanisms or systems or policies? So that big gap, the donor problem, is really about, if we think of this from a public policy perspective, any basic income that we really want to discuss, we need to fill the gap. And the gap is open, so you can be filled in all different ways. So this is the issue of having to complete, if you like, the definition of basic income in order to move from definition to actual policy. Then there's a separate problem, which I call the pizza problem, which is that if you think of all these definitions, you know, regular, cash, individual, unconditional, universal, and so on, for permanent could be in there as well, right? If you think about this, you can imagine policies that are missing one of these, maybe more, right? So you have a lot of related compromise policies, if you like, and then we face a decision about how pure do we want to be. So from a public policy perspective, being very, very, very pure actually makes not much sense, okay? So from a public policy perspective, we often need to be pragmatic. We need to be able to compromise. That often means accepting variants of a basic income that are not a pure basic income, right? So for example, some people are talking about participation income. You know, it's sort of conditional in a broad sense, but it has all the other features of basic income. Other people may be talking about schemes that don't provide cash on a regular basis, but give it in big chunks, like at the start of your life. You know, there used to be this big debate about basic capital, stakeholder grants, and so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of policies. On each of the definition dimension, you can have some version that basically misses that, if you like. And the biggest problem here is, at what point are we basically taking out too many? So maybe if we miss one feature, it's okay, we can still play with that. But if we miss two features, it just, it's a different thing. We have to stop, so to speak, right? So donut problem, pizza problem are two of the ongoing issues that you need to think about when you want to move from design to actual policy. Why does the design matter? Well, so I always like to go back to the statement of Brian Berry, who's pictured here, who said the following, and I'm just going to read the quote because it's good fun. Asking about the pros or cons of basic income as such in general is rather like asking about the pros and cons of keeping a feline as a pet without distinguishing between a tiger or a tabby. Tabby is a regular cat, right? So, so in a sense, the reason why design variation matters is because it tells us a lot. The details really, really matter when we get to the question about what is it that a basic income really does? How does it work? And based on that, is it a good idea to introduce it in a specific context? So when people ask me, are you in favor or against basic income? I'm basically telling them, without further information, I can't tell you that. Right? I need more information about the sort of things that the donut problem and the pizza problem are telling us about, right? So, but the reason why is that these things are not just about definition. These things are very, very practical matters that have an impact on what matters further down the line in public policy development. So that actually leads us to another question, which is, when we think about basic income, are we actually talking about radical departure, transformation? Is this a very different thing? Remember the platypus thing. So it, obviously as a policy, it looks very different. But is it a massive departure / transformation of, say, society, the economy, social protection as we know it? Or is it actually something quite pragmatic where we're more talking about, this is recalibration, adaptation of current policy? Or maybe actually it could be both. Maybe, one of the ways in which basic income works is it starts out as recalibration adaptation. We start sort of on a low basis, with a low level basic income, try and integrate it into existing policy. But as it starts functioning, perhaps it does have important transformative effects that over time really does kind of lead us to this radical departure. So that's still very, very much an ongoing open type of question, right? But it has a lot to do with which is the type of basic income policy that we put in there. The more, so to speak, you go on the pragmatic side with some of these design features, the easier it is to integrate the basic income at the moment, right? But of course, the less we're going to have in terms of some of these transformative effects. The more your basic income design really goes on the radical end, right? Think of this in terms of a higher level, say taxed by wealth taxes and so on and so forth. Those are big features that make it less likely that it's going to get implemented. But of course, on the other hand, once it is implemented, that does really going to have a change thing, right? So those are the sort of big questions that we face when we think about basic income from a public policy perspective. And one final point, very, very important point, actually, it really, really is important to think about basic income in context. So the short version of this is that even implementing the same basic income in a country like Finland or Germany or Chile or Namibia or Korea, you name it, is going to have a lot of different effects. And the main reason for that is because these countries are so very, very different. And they are very, very different, for example, in terms of the background institutions, different social protection systems in place, some very minimal, very residual, others much, much more developed, different sort of financing options, different sort of taxation systems, and, different backgrounds around labor market policies and institutions. Basic income will interact with all of these. So one way to think about it is that perhaps we need to start thinking of a basic income model, not just about basic income, but about the combination of basic income in a particular social protection context. So here are sort of four very, very stylized type of models, right? So you can imagine sort of 50 different variants of these. And, in no way does this reflect reality, obviously. But it gives you a bit of a sense of the sort of, big chunk kind of views we can have. So for example, you can imagine a residual basic income model in a context where there's really no social protection in place, and basic income is the one thing that we could implement, even pitched at the extreme poverty line, which is very, very meager, right? This is not a lot. Even at that point, it could actually do a lot of work, so to speak. And perhaps in some contexts, this is effectively the best we can do. So, while the residual basic income model doesn't look like the most interesting one, if the context only allows for this, then that may be the way we have to go. In other ways, or in other countries, perhaps the way to go is more the segmented basic income model, Model B. This is effectively thinking about, okay, there are sort of dualized, if you like, societies where some groups of people are very, very well protected in terms of social protection, right? They have access to all sorts of things, perhaps through work and so on and so forth. But there's really, really big gaps. So certain groups really, really fall through. So perhaps there, the feasible option is to think about a segmented basic income, filling in the gaps with a basic income as much as possible. That's not fully universal. So the people who think this, basic income should be a pure thing, should be fully universal, that's not fitting that picture. But it is still doing a lot of interesting work, plugging the gaps. And combined with the social protection in place, it could get us, in sense, at a proper level, right? Then, you have your moderate basic income, which is very much your standard model, right? Where basic income is sort of pitched at quite a low level, but combined with social protection policies, we do get a good combination. That is interesting in many ways. This is effectively the sort of proposal that, say, Philippe van Perez and Yannick van der Borgt were pushing, and many, many people along those lines think that this is the most feasible option, in a sense, in most countries, right? Especially in the sort of more, developed welfare state, mature welfare state type of context. The biggest issue that you have here is that everything here, of course, it does depend on the interaction between two very different systems, right? We have this very universal flat rate, unconditional universal basic income. And then we have social protection policies. And in a sense, the image here is a bit misleading because it all just assumes, you got this big red block, but actually these are all separate policies, right? So different policies, different rules, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't quite look like that. It's going to be a lot more, a bit fragmented, and there might still be gaps here. And then there's big issues about, interaction between, say, an unconditional part and a conditional part of the system. So, if part of my income is an unconditional basic income, but the other part is from, say, social assistance or some social insurance scheme that actually does require me to, whatever, apply for jobs every week, go to the unemployment office and so on, keep going through all these systems. How is that actually fully changing my life? I mean, the unconditional part may not be doing much because the conditional part is still there doing everything, right? So you have those sort of questions. Model D, the comprehensive one, that's the full utopian one, if you like, where basic income kind of takes care of everything in the poverty line. That's the one that gives us the exit option that everyone is always talking about, right? Where, we don't like our job, we just take our business elsewhere, it's all fine. On top of that, we still have social protection. So, so it's the full generous kind of system. That's great if you can have it. But that in many, many ways runs into so many problems around, well, financial sustainability, one, but especially political feasibility, right? So the point of saying this, putting all this, is that, this is not about thinking which is the best model. It's very much about thinking which is the best model in a particular context, and where we need to really, really have a clear sense of what already exists. How is basic income, inserting basic income in that model? How is that going to impact the, what's happening in that particular country, in that particular jurisdiction? And what are the sort of feasibility constraints, right? What's the financial space within which we can work, but especially what's the political feasibility within which we can work, and so on and so forth. So this very much by way of introduction. So trying to start from, a simple definition, but trying to show that from a public policy perspective, there's really a number of complications coming into it, leading up to the point where basic income itself really is only just part of the story. So moving on to the second part. So now we go more normative and legal. And the big question here is whether basic income is a social right. So, starting off from this idea of, if we talk about basic income, we do need to have a normative justification. So Brian Berry, same guy from, the cats and the tiger, right? So he actually made a really, really interesting distinction between two ways of justifying basic income. The one is pragmatic, where basically you have to think of what are the social goals that we want to promote. We're worried about poverty, we're worried about inequality, about health, about care issues, and so on and so forth. And, our current welfare state is supposed to do things, but it's not really working very well, and basic income can basically just do this much better. So there's a very sort of instrumental kind of relation, very pragmatic justification, which is all based on the idea that, look, whatever is the goals that we want to put forward, the existing systems are not working well, basic income can do much better. A little aside, that sort of argument became a big deal during the pandemic, for example, right? So one of the things that we had during the pandemic was effectively stress testing existing social protection, often finding that that really wasn't working out very, very well. And then basic income or basic income type or emergency basic income type of schemes were often put forward or proposed, and in a few cases sort of implemented in a very, very temporary fashion, right? So that's very much the pragmatic justification. So then the principal justification, this is the argument that, well, pragmatics is all fine, but ultimately basic income is about social justice. So Philippe van Parijs very, very famously talks about that all the time, right? He basically thinks that ultimately the justification for basic income is that it can be directly derived, linked to a concept of social justice. In his case, that's all about real freedom, the freedom to do whatever one might want to do. There's other options, right? So you have republicanism, which is all about avoiding domination. There's capability theory, there's recognition theory. There's, of course, also the sort of the social contract theory that Bernard Neumarker was talking about last lecture. It's important to realize that two things, I guess, about the principal justification. The one is, because it's directly derived from a concept of social justice, you have to realize, one, that there are multiple concepts of social justice around. So there's competition there, right? So, it's not enough to say, I think basic income is justified because of social justice, because the next question is, well, what is your conception / concept of social justice? And does that get us there? Okay. And the second thing is, because there's competition, it also means that if I don't buy into maybe there is a good justification for, say, basic income and real freedom, maybe that link makes sense. But if I don't buy into the theory of real freedom, then in a sense, by implication, I also can't buy into the basic income. So there's a cost to the principal justification, which means you do have to buy into the underlying theory. If that happens, that's fine. Then you can make that work. But of course, if you're not buying into that theory and you have an alternative theory, then you need to do all the work again to get to the principal justification. Social rights, in my view, are sort of a little bit in between. I actually find it hard to classify them, whether this is pragmatic and principled. And maybe that just shows that Brian Berry distinction, in a sense, it was very nice and handy. But maybe it's not quite capturing everything, right? But I thought I would put it forward there just to give you a sense of linking into, the sort of the practical stuff into the normative. So on to actual social rights. So the reason why I think it's important to talk about social rights, so there's a long history, if you like. There's actually a history going back to Thomas Paine and so on, talking about basic income as a right. Okay, but even if you go to, say, Bien Congresses and other gatherings, people often say this, right? We should have a right to basic income. We have a right to basic income. And the real question is, so what does that mean? Like, does that mean anything actually? And how do we get there? So in basically the rest of the talk, I kind of want to go through some of these options. So let's start with 4 types of rights talk. So the first one is basic income could be what's often called a manifesto right. So that's actually a term from Joel Feinberg, which actually goes back literally, I think, 70s, something like that. So it goes back quite a long time. The point of a manifesto right is that this is actually political talk. It's rhetoric. This is effectively people saying that, look, I wish there would be a basic income. So I'm just going to say people should have a right to basic income. That's it. It's all about aspiration. There's nothing really there per se in terms of moral right, legal right, constitutional right. It's effectively only about, a strong expression of a desire that this should happen, in a sense. So it's very much political, not so much philosophical, legal. And for that reason, we're just going to leave that aside. We'll focus on the other 3. The other 3 is the idea that basic income is a moral right. So there's a very, very strong ground that means that, I have a right, which also means I can hold other people under an obligation to provide me with that right or respect or promote or protect that particular right, right? So think of it, it's a little bit of a shortcut, but think of it as a moral interest, a very, very strong moral interest that genuinely isn't just about me wanting something. It's about something that I really, really need to, for example, live my life with dignity and so on and so forth. Next step, we're going more institutional. Basic income as a legal right. This is effectively a legal claim. So there's a system in place, a judicial system in place, and I can put a claim in there, effectively. Thirdly, then, basic income as a constitutional right. That claim itself is then constitutionally, institutionally protected. There's another layer there which effectively guarantees that my legal right is effectively going to be delivered to me, right? So people who often claim that there should be a right to basic income, they kind of go from the one to the other. They think it's a moral right and a legal right and even a constitutional right. What I'm going to try and show is that these things are quite different, and each of these does raise a lot of questions on how to get there. So first, before we go to the actual things, why does it actually matter that we give basic income right status? So, I mean, the fact that some people say, well, we should have a right, I mean, that doesn't mean that it matters. But there is a sense in which talking about basic income rights and talking about basic income policy are quite different, right? So policies can be a lot of different things, but rights are things that somehow should be given some priority. It's almost like there's a little bit of a ranking there. It's not absolute, right? There are trade-offs, and that gets us into very complicated business. But by and large, there's always this sense that, look, policies that are also rights are somehow more important. Okay, so it is about priority. There's 3 things that we can get, I think, from giving basic income rights status. First thing has to do with expressive value. So in a sense, giving basic income a right signals the comparative importance of basic income versus other policies, right? It signals this to the people who receive it. So for example, making sure that everyone understands, every citizen / resident or, member of the society who's entitled to basic income, if that it ensures that these people understand that they get this as a matter of entitlement. Okay, this is not charity, it's your right. Okay, that expresses something very, very different and very important. It also signals this to decision makers, you know, whether this is implementation people or actually more high-level policy decision makers and so on. It signals to them that, look, basic income is a thing that to be taken seriously, to be given priority, and so on and so forth. So providing basic income right status means it gives it expressive value. It also means that there's some sort of assurance of effective implementation. So here it's important to have a sense of a distinction between sort of nominal and substantive universalism. So we can nominally have a system in place where everyone is entitled to a basic income. So think of it as the following. Imagine that you have a country where there is a basic income in place. Everyone's entitled to it, okay? You just have to ask for it. But then it turns out that there's groups of society that don't ask for it. So think of the homeless, for example. Why? Because they're marginalized, they're out of the system, they may not have the right information, they don't know how to do this, and so on and so forth. For whatever reason, these are people who are out. So nominally, formally, they are part of it. It's universal, everyone's entitled. But substantively, in real terms, you have gaps. Giving basic income right status actually puts an obligation on the state to fill that gap. So this means, you know, it's not enough to just have it on the books. There's a genuine obligation to make sure that whoever is entitled to the basic income effectively gets it. And thirdly, interestingly enough, it poses a prima facie obligation on the state to really, really make sure that it is instituted, right? So it's a reversal of the justificatory burden. What do I mean by that? Many policies, there's a sense of, okay, we need to justify that the state spends the money on this, right? So for example, whatever, you have something like a healthcare policy. There's always a debate about, okay, we need to spend this money. Yeah, sure. Okay, should we do this? Should we spend it? More doctors, more medication, cheaper medication, and so on and so forth. We get all these debates, but it's always about justifying implementing the policy. The moment you give something right status, it's actually reversing the logic here. At that moment, the state is responsible for having this in place. So it's the failure to legislate, the failure to budget, the failure to implement that needs justification, right? Now, in some cases, this is where, you know, remember I said in the beginning that, you know, rights have priority, but not absolute priority. There are cases where states legitimately fail to provide for rights, right? I mean, think of this as, I don't know, even in an emergency context like a pandemic, you know, it may be that certain rights were not provided for because the capacity just wasn't there, you know, the too many things happening, bureaucratic capacity was gone, and so on and so forth. So there may be cases where states are justified not providing for rights, but the justification always has to be there, and it is on the failure side, not on the introduction side. So those are three important aspects of rights status. I'm going to skip this one. It's not that important. We can pick it up later if we need to. It's sort of a little interesting technical thing, but forget about it for now. So now we go to the three things, right? Moral rights, legal rights, and constitutional rights. So first of all, on the moral rights, I want to say up front, I don't think, and actually this is based on joint work with Leticia Morales, so we don't think that basic income is or can be a moral right. Why is that? So in order to have a moral right, you need to have a theory of rights. And one of the leading ones is called the interest theory of rights, which goes down to a number of people. But Joseph Raz, the legal philosopher, is very, very famous in that. And Raz basically argued the following. He basically said that, look, for something to be a right, for a rights holder to have a particular right, it means that there has to be a vital interest that is so important that we can hold other people under a duty to provide for it. Okay? And the reason why it's pitched like that is that we have to keep in mind that for me to claim a right and to have other people have an obligation, that means that these other people's lives are restricted in a certain way, right? You know, perhaps there's certain things they can't do. So for example, if I have a right, I'm trying to think of an example now, that's not a basic example. I mean, imagine that I have a right to basically walk around in town without being harassed. That puts a restriction on you for harassing me, right? You're not allowed to get in my way if I have the right to walk around freely. Now, this is a very obvious example. We all think, of course, that makes sense. Okay, fine. But it's still a restriction of some sort. Now, when we talk about providing actual positive rights, that might mean, for example, obligations for citizens to basically, you know, be taxed and so on and so forth. So part of my income may be put forward to paying for your basic income and so on and so forth. So we need to have a theory that explains that. So the bottom line here is that a moral right under this theory, there's other ones, right? But under this theory, the idea is that a moral right constitutes, protects, or promotes vital interest. So there's a strong version and a weak version. So in the strong version, can we say that basic income constitutes a vital interest? So some people have tried to answer this as yes. And the yes basically fits into the following story. In a modern society, i.e. modern capitalism that we live in now, income/money is a vital feature. Without income, you know, we're gonna basically, well, effectively die in many cases, right? So your life is going to be very, very painful, brutish, and short. So income is a vital feature of modern life, therefore basic income. Now, the problem with that is that if we grant that income is a vital feature, and we have this, for example, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, says that we have the right to the standard of adequate living. If we can link that to income, it seems that we have a clear angle here. The biggest problem for basic income is that that right to standard of adequate living, that income feature, can be provided in multiple ways. So we could think, for example, of a combination of guaranteed employment, right? Employer of last resort stuff, and a minimum income. That could also satisfy this. Or we can think of participation income. Or we can think perhaps we just need to make our current welfare state/social protection systems more generous. The key feature with all this is that basic income is just one out of a multitude of options that allows us to satisfy what is the real vital interest. So in some sense, to argue that basic income constitutes a vital interest is a category mistake. You know, basic income is part of the story that may provide the thing that is the real vital interest, okay? And for that reason, we can't argue that basic income constitutes a vital interest, and so the strong version fails. What about a weaker version? A weaker version would say something along the lines that basic income promotes vital interest. Now, based on what I said before, perhaps that could work. However, it doesn't really work, because the main reason is that if we have these multitude of policies, potential ways of satisfying the right to adequate living, to then argue that basic income does this better actually makes basic income dependent on contingent empirical facts. And that's an insufficient standard for establishing a moral right. So think of it this way. If I have a right not to be attacked, physically attacked, right? I have a right not to have my personal integrity violated, etc. That moral right exists independent of the circumstances outside. So it exists in a utopian society where everyone is very nice and respectful and so on. And it exists in a society where people may be violent, right? That moral right exists. Of course, the way to protect it can change, but the moral right does not change independent of circumstances. But in this argument, the basic income does change depending on circumstances. It's contingent on working better than some of these alternative policies. And there may be circumstances where these alternative policies work better. And therefore, even on this ground, the weaker version, basic income, cannot be set to have the strong link to basically promote vital interest, right? So basically, we conclude basic income cannot be a moral right. There's a confusion there effectively between basic income as the policy and the thing that is the moral right, which is something like standard of adequate living. What about legal rights then? So we could basically say, okay, well, maybe we forget about the moral right now, but can we have a legal right? Can we talk about the right to basic income still from a legal perspective, which is, which is a different thing, right? We don't have to have a moral right in order to have a legal right. For example, if I basically have the legal right to drive my car and to go I don't know, go shopping and cross green lights. And of course, I have to stop for red lights. But when the light is green, that crosses and so on and so forth. That's a constitution of legal rights. That includes the property right I have in my car. And that includes conventional rights because, for example, traffic systems and so on basically explain who can drive when, in what way, and so on and so forth. All of these can be looked at as giving you legal rights or legal freedoms, right? But none of that does necessarily give you a moral right. Well, on the ownership thing, maybe we can discuss that. But on the traffic example, for sure, we don't want to argue that you have a moral right to drive through a green light, for example, right? So a lot of that is conventional. Nevertheless, when we talk about establishing the legal right to basic income, we don't need to have a proper foundation. Why? Because introducing a basic income comes with opportunity costs, right? So, it effectively has an impact on various other things that we could be doing, but we're not going to be doing because, whatever the finances are taken, or perhaps because it means introducing a basic income, we organize the economy in a different way, and so on and so forth. There's always going to be some opportunity costs. Introducing a basic income effectively creates winners and losers, no matter what. We just need to have a good argument why the winners should be the winners, in a sense, okay? So obviously, direct justification through moral rights is not available because, this is what I argued in the previous slide, no moral right. So could there be an indirect justification? So more instrumental. So this gets us back to the superiority of basic income as a policy instrument, okay, to satisfying important goals like the adequate standard of living, but there could be others, right? Could be, maybe there's a link between basic income and health, as we increasingly find. There could be links with education, with decent housing, with labor rights. All of these are sort of rights that are already enshrined in international documents, right? So why is it that the superiority of basic income here works? Well, the standard for a legal right, it's okay to have an instrumental justification. That does not work for the moral right, but for the legal right, that's totally fine. So where does that leave us? Well, it means that now we're discussing what is the impact of basic income on key social objectives. It has to be the comparative impact, however, right? So we can't just argue basic income has an effect. That's not enough. It actually has to have an effect a better effect compared to alternatives. And these alternatives could be both actual, but also hypothetical, because, for example, there's a debate at the moment between basic income and universal basic services, and neither of these exist. They're both hypothetical, so to speak. So we do want to then be able to compare and say, actually, this is the one where we should go, this is the direction we should be go. So it's not just actual. Basic income is not just pitched against actual alternatives, but also hypothetical ones. There's two ways to do this. One way I think is problematic, and one way we think might offer an interesting alternative. So we call these disjunctive and conjunctive. So conjunctive together, disjunctive separate. On the disjunctive approach, here is how it works. We identify a social goal. a particular social goal, the sort of social goal that's sufficiently important, vital interest, and so on and so forth. We can have a number of those, right? So think about the right to adequate living, health, and so on and so forth. We identify this goal, and then we do pairwise comparisons between basic income and whichever is the competitor scheme, you know? So we compare basic income and participation income. We compare basic income and the existing welfare state. We compare basic income and universal basic services, and so on and so forth. Question then is, if in each of these comparisons, basic income is the superior one, does that give us enough for a legal right? So the issue we have with that approach is that it may be the case that for any single social objective, basic income is superior. The biggest problem, though, is that if a basic income is superior to the right to adequate living, but there are other social goals. So how do we decide which of these social goals takes priority? Now, of course, it could be that basic income is superior on all social objectives. But we then think, and this is problem two, that that's way too strong, too much, too demanding type of criterion. It's just very unlikely, if you really think about it, it's very unlikely that basic income is going to be the best policy on any single social goal that we want to put forward. So the dilemma, in a sense, is we can demonstrate basic income being really, really good, superior on one or two or maybe three, whatever type of social policies, but never on all of them. And if they're not, if basic income isn't superior on all of them, then we end up in a debate about why to give basic income priority, effectively giving priority on one social objective over another. And that's a very, very complicated discussion, right? So, and that's, you know, that's complicated and not necessarily for this sort of lecture at the moment, but I hope you see the issue, right? So the disjunctive approach looks promising, but runs into a problem, a big problem. So here is the alternative option. Maybe we can do a conjunctive approach. And the conjunctive approach works the following. Now we're doing these pairwise comparisons, but we do them for all social objectives. And we accept that basic income may not be the ultimate winner in each case. But perhaps basic income can do well in each of these cases. So perhaps basic income is not the winner in all social objectives compared to all different policies. So, you know, say on health, it does really well, but of course, maybe providing, I don't know, cancer screening is more important. Just an example, right? I'm not saying that this is the case. Or on education, it does really, really well, but perhaps, you know, providing whatever free access to university or schooling up to university is more important, and so on and so forth. So the story here is that, in a sense, basic income does really, really well on each of these. And in some cases, it might even be the best option, but not in all of them. But here is the really, really interesting feature. If it is true that basic income does well on all the policies, then perhaps the reason why we should give basic income the right status is because it has such a broad impact. So in some sense, it's a mistake to think that it has to win in all of the potential social goals. There is an important social value in having a policy that does really, really well across the board. And perhaps basic income is a unique policy in doing this, right? Because, for example, if you think about it, you know, basic income has an impact on health. Well, so does cancer screening, but cancer screening only really works on health. And free university kind of, you know, or free education kind of works on education. It may have some spillover effects, but basic income does really well there. And it does really well for the adequate standard of living. And perhaps it can do well on even decent housing because it can subsidize housing and so on and so forth, so relieving some of the homelessness issues. If that is true, and it is an if, right? It's an empirical question. But if that's true, then the width, the broad range of impact of basic income is the key feature here. So under the conjunctive story, we're not looking this way, we're looking this way. And then suddenly we may have a good reason why basic income gives us enough ground to turn it into a legal right. And there's actually, there's a couple more things to say about this. So why is it that we're really interested in this? It's important to realize what legal rights are partly doing. So positive spillovers between policy and rights are very welcome. They're often actually affirmed by judges and stuff, right? Whenever judges have to make decisions about policy things, I mean, anything that sort of, spills over policy into rights and rights into policy on the positive side, that's very welcome for a number of reasons. Individual rights often overlap different policy domains, and the same way one policy domain can overlap multiple rights. So it's not like a right and a policy, a right and a policy. No, these things are much more complicated. So in a sense, a policy that has a broad impact works much better in a situation where things get complicated. Secondly, right holders, you, me, every individual who is a right holder, right? Our social life spans multiple policy domains, and our legal rights try to recognize this. So, so in a sense, one of the reasons why basic income as a legal right could work is because our social lives are complicated, and it supports us in many different ways as we move through these different social domains. And as we move, basically from child to adult to pensioner and so on and so forth, right? So in all sorts of ways, the fact that basic income can support a multitude of things is something that we want to recognize here. And then there's really interesting sort of efficiency arguments, because having a broad sort of support, or supporting a basic income that has a broad impact, avoids a lot of unnecessary trade-offs. So competition for resources between different rights, because it supports different rights at the same time, so to speak, right? So it also avoids having to relitigate the priority of specific rights and specific policies, which was exactly the problem with the disjunctive approach, right? So the first one ultimately ran into the problem that, we need to kind of have a sense of which is the priority. And, And in this case, we now suddenly find that this is not necessary, because basic income does well for multiple priorities. So we don't have to get into this very complicated type of discussion. Now, it is true that underlying all this foundation still is contingent on empirical performance, right? Now, for legal right, that's fine. I mean, we do, historically, we do change legal status of certain policies based on, whatever, changing circumstances, new empirical evidence, and so on and so forth, right? We used to have certain rights that we don't have anymore, and vice versa, right? We create new rights and new right status all the time. But the fact that this is based on empirical performance is not a big problem. And actually, for basic income, of course, it puts the challenge that we have to demonstrate that it actually has this broad impact. But that's precisely what we're doing, right? One of the things that we're doing with all these pilots is creating more and more information that allows us this broad basis, in a sense. So from this sort of perspective, things are kind of going in the right way, if you like. So one final question. I kind of lost track of time, but this is literally my final slide. So basically what I've said so far is manifesto right, yeah, fine, but not interesting. Moral right, no, we can't. Legal right, yes, we can, but with a very specific trajectory. If that works out, fine. Now, assuming that we have this legal right, do we have to go so far as to push it to a constitutional right? Again, there's a number of people who basically argue that this is very obvious the case. Like, basic income is important, we should give it legal right, and we should put it in a constitution. I've heard so many people say this. Most of the people who say we should put this in the constitution have no idea how constitutions work, what they are. One of the things to keep in mind is a constitution isn't just a document, right? A constitution, yes, it's a document, but it's also part of a whole process that is meant to enforce this document. And the process, understanding the process is really important. And when you understand it, it turns out to be slightly problematic. But let's backtrack for a moment. Why should we have a constitutional right to basic income? So effectively, a constitutional right would basically just add a layer of protection to your legal right. And it's trying to deal with two types of stability problems, if you like. One is the problem of resilience. Resilience is all about, being able to resist political pressures to actually dismantle basic income or changes in design that make it less effective. So, for example, changing the level of basic income, or somehow sneaking in some conditions, or withdrawing support for some of the implementation measures, so that effectively that it does introduce some gaps, although in theory everyone is entitled, and so on and so forth, right? So you can imagine, once we have a basic income in place, there may be political pressure to change this. One example is Alaska, for example. There's been quite a lot of pressure to basically, reduce or somehow change or even get rid of the permanent dividend, right? So the permanent fund dividend. So, and this is true. I mean, this is to be, this is normal politics. Political pressure on policy is normal politics. So, and in sense, putting a basic income in the constitution, so to speak, would protect against that. Another thing is problems of robustness. So robustness is basically a failure of the policy to adapt to changing circumstances. So one way, I mean, it could be a very simple thing, right? So imagine that the level of your basic income is not indexed. And, so after 20 years, like nominally speaking, you have the same amount of money, but effectively in real terms, your basic income has gone down and down and down, right? So, I mean, this actually happens a lot. I mean, like if you actually look at this happens a lot in other social policies as well, right? A lot of social protection policies, failure of updating is a big thing. Interestingly, a failure of updating doesn't require action, but it's very deliberate, right? So this is a problem of robustness. So again, protecting basic income in the Constitution could actually allow judges to intervene and basically insist that the government updates its program so that it meets the new challenges, okay? So it looks like this could be a good idea. Why is it not a good idea? The main reason why it's not a good idea has to do with two things. One is the fact that ultimately constitutional protection very much depends on judicial review. It depends on ultimately there being a process by which someone can challenge what's been going on, and it gets under judicial review, right? So it's effectively judges and judicial reasoning that will matter whether a constitutional right is actually working, right? And then you have another thing, which is judges really are often incompetent. I mean, they are competent to be judges, but they're not necessarily competent in terms of understanding all the full details of what's going on specific policies. So judicial incompetence is something that is quite common. Like, I mean, policy areas are often really, really very complicated, and judges often end up at the constitutional level, they end up having to look at all sorts of different cases, right? So you combine judicial review and judicial incompetence, you then have a bit of a problem. So before we get to the actual problem, it's important to think about, if we put a constitutional right, how do we actually put this in a text? And so there's sort of a famous philosophical distinction between a type and a token. So every type, every generic class of something has multiple tokens, multiple specific interpretations. So you can imagine a UBI type, let's say the standard definition of basic income, Van Parijs and Van der Borst. And each of these has UBI tokens. Each of these has a multitude of actually designed basic income schemes. coming back to first part of my lecture, right, where I was telling you about some of these complications. Now, which of these is going to be in a constitution? Well, most constitutions have type of requirement. They have general statements that then require judicial interpretation, right? There's a few constitutions that have more tokens, like the Mexican Constitution is massive, right? So it has a lot of really kind of specific requirements, but for very good reasons, this is not a common practice, right? So, and actually, for example, I mean, I live in Chile. I'm actually talking to you from Chile now. People here know that we were, well, a few years ago, there was a big thing around the new constitutional convention that came up with a draft constitution of 500 pages. And a lot of people were criticizing it because of the level of detail. It had a lot of very specific type of token features, if you like. And it was really very specific. But because of that, it was also massive. And this was problematic for a constitutional document, right? So generally speaking, we're going to find constitutional rights in the type feature, which means you're going to have a general description of a basic income, which then needs judges to interpret in a specific way to assess whether a particular policy or failure of policy by the government violates a constitutional right, yes or no. That's how it works. So that now gets us to judicial incompetence, because judges now suddenly find that they have to adjudicate a particular claim. You know, someone or some organization is claiming that their constitutional right to basic income is violated by government either trying to change the policy or failing to update it. And judges have to decide on this based on a very basic definition of what constitutes a constitutional right of basic income. So, and then they can basically respond in two big ways, right? They can either opt for judicial deference. Judicial deference is basically judges saying, I'm sorry, you know, I'm unable to really lead on this. This is not what we should be doing. It goes back to politics. This happens a lot. You know, judges often basically decide on particular constitutional cases that they're not in a position to decide. And they basically say, go back to politics, legislate back again. They may put in specific conditions. For example, they may say something like, okay, the government is not allowed to just change the basic income thing, but it has to provide a justification, and maybe it has to go through some process with consulting key stakeholders, and maybe there's a waiting time of a couple of years before any changes can be made. But ultimately, it goes back to politics. If it goes back to politics, then yes, I'm actually almost done. Sorry. Sorry, I totally lost track of time. If it goes back to politics, there is no resilience. Remember, resilience was the key feature we had to do. Secondly, judges can say, actually, no, I'm going to make a decision, but then that interpretation can fully be incompatible with what basic income advocates want, right? So judges make their own interpretation, which is could be completely separate from the people who basically say government is violating my constitutional right to basic income. And therefore, it's actually also not offering the right sort of protection, because it could mean they change the design of basic income, judges themselves, which means there's no proper response to the robustness problem. So the constitutional trap is effectively the following. You know, in the light of how a basic income would feature in a constitution, judges basically have to make an interpretation, have to make a decision, and they can either say, look, we're incapable of doing this, it goes back to politics, no proper protection, or they can do an interpretation, and the chances are there's no guarantee that this in any way will be the sort of interpretation that aligns with what the challengers effectively want. So there's no real protection there either. So for those reasons, when you understand how constitutional process works and how judicial review works, we think that actually legal rights, okay, but pushing it to constitutional rights is going to be too far, going to be problematic. We need to find other ways to protect basic income as a legal right. Constitution is not a good option. And that's it. And I apologize for taking so much time. I totally lost track here. So.
No, totally fine. So we have enough time, and yeah,
My
thank you
phone
very
ran. I was going to time myself, and my bloody phone ran out of battery. So
no, totally fine. Thank you for the, yeah, I think really good presentation, really interesting. A lot of topics that we can discuss now. And as the last time, I would, everyone can ask every time a question, raise your hand, so unmute yourself, and we can also moderate that a little bit, but I'm sure, so there is no problem if you want to unmute yourself and to ask. And don't be shy. Yeah. Well, maybe I start with one question, but because it's really interesting from an economic perspective. We are trainee, or our view are trainee by something that we call Tinneberger rule, which means you have one political variable, one tool, and then you get your results. Don't mix it. Don't use one tool for two policy goals. And it seems to me, and this is also what I have in my own research, this conjunction impact is a different thing, right? And we have to understand that and better, yeah, in a complete different way. Maybe you can say something about that.
I mean, so I'm not familiar with you know, the Tindenberg. Is that Jan Tindenberg, the Dutch guy, or? Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, I know some of his other stuff, but not that particular rule. I mean, to me, it sounds very odd, right? I'm sure there's probably some technical reason why that's necessary in economic research, but from a public policy perspective, it's absolutely odd to think that, you know, we can divide policy domains in that clear sense, you know? So, I mean, we know for a fact that policy domains overlap and interact, and policy interventions have spillover effect. And in a sense, what the conjunctive approach is trying to say is trying to make a